Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me, Season 2. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anisha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you, and leave what doesn't.
Alrighty, let's get into it.
Woo-hoo.
We have made it all the way to N.
And in Season 2. This is our second episode for N.
I know. I'm still really mind blown that we've done 2 whole seasons of this and we're about to complete our second season too. This is exciting.
Yes. And our last season's N was, what was the topic?
The last one?
Yeah. Is it narcissism?
Z's,
no, the last letter N episode. For season 1. Was it narcissism? Navigating narcissism, I think.
It was, yeah.
And that actually got a lot of listens. So thank you for our listeners. I'm pretty sure I saw that on top of the list of the number of listens per episode. It was a good topic.
It was a great topic. I know I think it was a really good topic for the time because there was a lot of stuff going around social media about narcissism and the word just kind of be thrown around for anybody.
Exactly.
That happens. Not great. But I think being able to talk about it and really understand what it is, what it's not, that was great.
For sure.
That's what I love about our podcast. Education. So for season 2's end topic, we are doing neurodiversity. Thank you. Thank you very much for that appropriate cheer. Woohoo! So as always, as we've made a new habit of, I'm going to start with a little bit of a background. What is it? What does it mean? I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this term already, the neurodiversity, but I don't think there's been a lot of full definitions about it, right? We just kind of throw it casually in conversation. So what exactly is it? Well, Harvard Health defines neurodiversity as an idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving. And these differences are not viewed as deficits. So the word neurodiversity refers to the diversity of all people, but it is often used in the context of autism spectrum disorder, for example, as well as other neurological or developmental conditions like ADHD or other learning disabilities. Now, the neurodiversity movement emerged in the 1990s, and the idea was they wanted to increase acceptance and inclusion of all people while embracing the neurological differences.
Yes, I love that. It's always striking to me how recent a lot of these movements are. I know the American Disabilities Act anniversary is coming up, or I guess when we're recording this episode, it's the end of July, right? And it's coming up. And when I was learning the history about it, because I'm working on a project on it at work, that was also very recent, in the 1960s, 70s, which is so interesting, right? These civil rights for people with different needs, learning needs, people that are neurodivergent, right? These people are people and human, they deserve human rights. And how recent were these movements that happened, which is striking.
Yeah. What did they do before then? Goodness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Why was this not done earlier?
Yeah. The 1900s were the rock star. So the thing that I really want to highlight in this, is it's not neurodivergent people are not okay, this is what's normal and this is what's not normal. And neurodivergent people are not normal. Neurodivergent is just a different way that the brain processes things, but it's not abnormal. And I'll get into this later, but basically inclusive terms with the neurodivergence, its counterpart is neurotypical. Yeah. So it's not normal, it's neurotypical, as in this is what we see predominantly. Typically. Exactly. But you'll see that they're very careful in not making it normal, not normal, normal, abnormal. It's neurotypical, neurodivergent.
Yes. And we can also talk about for a really long time probably how normal is just this very not a real thing, right? In any aspect.
Exactly.
What is normal? Yeah.
What is it? It's just what's predominantly seen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I went on to find a really awesome article by Cleveland Clinic that really broke down a lot of this helpful stuff that I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
So one of the things I first start off with saying is that neurodivergent people, they have specific strengths that come with it too. It's not seen as, again, it's not a deficit. they come with specific kind of strengths. For example, better memory, being able to mentally picture 3D objects easily, the ability to solve complex mathematical calculations in their head, and like lots of little things like that. Continue to reference, other strengths throughout today's episode, but I thought to start off with, that was a good segue into the holisticness of what it means to be neurodivergent. And like I said, it's neurodivergent and then neurotypical. So it's not abnormal and normal. That's important to recognize. And they go on to basically talk a little bit about like research. So experts' research shows that the words and languages related to the neurodiversity make a difference in how people live. People who are neurodivergent learn that it means they're different. Not that they're sick, not that they're defective, not that they're not normal, but different. And that they're more likely to be happier and aim higher in their careers. An example of this is someone who has dyslexia. So people with this condition struggle to read because their brain doesn't process the written language like the brain of someone without dyslexia. It tends to, almost like jumble words a little bit. However, people with dyslexia usually have brains that are better at processing or mentally picturing 3D objects. And that makes them much faster identifying optical illusions. And they have a natural talent for jobs like graphic design, arts, engineering, and like things that are consistent with that strength. Yeah. Isn't that so cool?
It is.
I
really
didn't know
cool.
that, like, as a whole, people who have dyslexia have this generic like skill, the strength in this other way.
Right.
That's really cool.
That can become a whole career. I feel like there's so much stigma around that, around people with, different needs, learning needs, people that are neurodivergent. Like, there's that stigma of like they are not able to do anything, they're not able to be independent, but that's not true at all.
And I have a really awesome list of a few people. I didn't, include a lot of people, but a list of a few people that this article highlighted of successful people doing like various successful things that are famous. Wow. So I'll get into that later.
Okay. I'm excited.
Yay. I want to talk about like other conditions that are usually very common underneath the umbrella of neurodivergent.
Okay.
This is by no means like a comprehensive list, but just a few examples. So like we already talked about, one of the conditions that would fall under the neurodivergent umbrella is autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, like I said earlier, dyslexia, like we just talked about, but also something called dyscalculia. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's difficulty with math. I never heard of that before. That's fascinating. Then there's dysgraphia, which is difficulty with reading, and dyspraxia, which is difficulty with coordination. There's also intellectual disabilities that would fall underneath this category. Even mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, OCD would fall under this category. Social anxiety would fall under this category, which is, a very specific type of anxiety. Yeah. And also highly sensitive people like me. You know what that means, to be highly sensitive?
Well, I mean,
a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
It sounds like you know what it means, right?
Yeah.
So highly sensitive people, basically what that means is these people have an increased like sensitivity to sensory information. So light, sound and noise are the same. Light, smell, and noise, which make them like really, really aware of the stimuli, like, and easily overstimulated by these senses. Right. That's just one example.
Yeah.
Also with emotions and other things like that. But yeah, that's me. And I did not know that. I did not know that. I mean, I knew I was a highly sensitive person, but I didn't know that I would fall into the category of neurodiverse until today. Yeah. I was like, what? No idea. This article continues on to say that neurodiversity refers to the unique way that each person's brain develops. That means it's not preventable, treatable, or curable because there's nothing wrong with it. So while there's nothing wrong with it, some people, like for example, we'll just take ADHD as an example. While there's nothing wrong with the way their brain develops, going to behavioral therapy, using medication can positively affect the quality of life, though, living in a very neurotypical kind of world. Right. So therapy programs can help people understand and play to their strengths, meaning, they basically show you how to make the best of your abilities and find the strengths in your abilities, and how you can basically adopt to the challenges, thereby minimizing, the interference in life, the challenges in life. Now, for the exciting part that we were talking about earlier. Okay. I have some
before you move on, I did want to point out something that I see in my work too is just there's a lot of chronic illnesses that can lead to neurodiversity as a side effect, like types of cancer like brain tumors or treatments like radiations that can affect the brain development in kids especially can lead to neurodiversity as well. So like having different disabilities, like developmental disabilities, like learning needs, like you mentioned, like sometimes neurodivergence can be developed because of those diagnoses,
And,
like a
and
progression of like a brain tumor affecting like a part of the brain, or treatment in the brain is affecting that part of the brain that is needed for a certain type of ability that's neurotypical, but then because of the progression or the prognosis, it can lead to neurodivergence.
that's fascinating. I had no idea.
Mm.
Do you see that happen often?
I mean, I don't personally directly work with neuro-oncology patients, but from working like with my colleagues and maybe sometimes helping those patients out because I'm not the primary for the neuro-oncology patients, I have learned that sometimes vision is lost, or sometimes they have different learning needs, some disabilities are developed, or development, like just the way like their ability to concentrate goes away, like just like different abilities can not be there anymore.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So, segueing back in, the thing that I said I would talk about was
Yes.
specific examples of famous and successful people who are also identified as
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergent. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, there is a animal scientist and author, Temple Grandin. He's very successful and he identifies as neurodivergent. Then there is the Oscar-winning actor, Sir Anthony Hopkins. Yeah. Musician and singer Florence Welch. And if you haven't heard of the last couple that I said, you'll definitely hear of these two. You ready for this?
Yes.
The Olympic gold medalist, Simone Biles.
Oh, well,
She's
wow.
neurodivergent, yeah.
Wow, I love
And
that.
climate activist, Greta Thunberg. Yeah. And clearly, going off of what you were saying earlier, Michelle, clearly this just is a tiny window into it, but it demonstrates that just because you're not neurodivergent doesn't mean you can't succeed in a neurotypical world.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely people, famous people, successful people who are managing to thrive
Mm-hmm.
with their neurodivergent diagnosis identity. So to summarize all of that in kind of a concise way, neurodiversity is a word used to explain the unique way that people's brains can work. While everyone's brain develops similarly, no two brains function just alike.
Mm-hmm.
Being neurodivergent means having a brain that works differently from the average or neurotypical person. This may be differences in social preferences, ways of learning, ways of communicating, and/or ways of perceiving the environment. Because of this, a neurodivergent person has different struggles and unique strengths. People who are neurodivergent can benefit from education and programs that help them develop their strengths, using them to their benefit to live happy, healthy, successful lives.
Love it.
All
Great
the research I've
definition.
got.
Great summary.
That was a pretty concise research, I think, that we've ever done.
Yeah, but it's very clear,
Yeah.
It's important to point these things out and also to dismantle the stigma that exists and these biases in our society that exist about people who are neurodivergent.
I love that you said that because that's a perfect segue into our next segment, South Asian stories as it relates to neurodivergence. Here we go.
I'm ready for this.
I found some really cool stuff. I'm going to focus on two particular parts of this. Okay. And the first part is a LinkedIn article titled Shattering the Silence, the Lack of South Asian Representation in Neurodiversity by Sandeep Bains. So Sandeep talks about how mental health and neurodivergence are rarely openly discussed within our South Asian community. He says that the stigma and cultural beliefs are often portraying them as character flaws or signs of weakness. Yes. And the silence that happens fosters this breeding ground for isolation and a lack of understanding for those that are struggling with this.
Right. So true. The silence perpetuates these assumptions that these are weaknesses and lack of or character flaws, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And signs of weakness, which it's definitely not. Just different, but we're scared of different, He gives a really wonderful example, which I want to, talk about. He says, imagine a child with ADHD who constantly fidgets in class, a behavior that can be seen as disrespectful in a culture that emphasizes respect and obedience. The child can't help it. They're not trying to be, disobedient. They're not trying to be disrespectful. They have this energy.
And the way
He
that
gives them
child is learning is not accommodating to what that child needs, like the learning need.
Exactly. He also gives a different example. He says, or a young adult on the autism spectrum who struggles with social interaction, who gets further ostracized by the emphasis on family and community. Now, granted, obviously autism spectrum is on a spectrum, right, as it says. So that's not going to be everyone's story, but as an example. Sandeep also goes on to say, like, the pressure to conform and the fear of bringing shame to the family creates significant barriers for seeking help and for, really creating a safer environment of acceptance and healthy ways of dealing with it. So he talks about a multi-pronged approach for change in the future.
Okay,
and it has 4 prongs.
Okay.
The first being culturally competent research. He mentions that funding research that specifically explore the neurodiversity within the South Asian community is really crucial because as it is currently, most of the research is predominantly like for research done on like white people. It's not very inclusive of South Asian communities and, the differences and the nuances in our norms. For example, for someone who's on the spectrum, sometimes eye contact can be an indicator of whether someone's on the spectrum. But also a lot of South Asians struggle with eye contact.
Right.
It's about, a little bit of respect and humility. They struggle with eye contact, so they can be misdiagnosed.
Right.
And so this is really important that he emphasizes culturally competent research. He also talks about inclusive diagnostic tools. So again, allowing for these assessments to consider cultural norms around communication, social interaction, behavior within that demographic. The third prong is building support systems, investing in culturally competent therapy. Because that's the other thing, right? You might be able to seek out support with somebody who is a therapist, but can they hold space for your intersectional identity? Not just as a neurodivergent person, but maybe also as how it relates within your cultural context.
Yeah.
So building relevant, culturally competent support systems. And the last one is amplifying South Asian voices. Always important. The more that we normalize it, the more that people come out who are similar backgrounds, who talk about it, normalize it, make it known, the more power we give it, in the sense of like, this is normal. This is not something to be ashamed about.
Right. Normalizing it is very important. Breaking the silence is very important because that silence itself perpetuates the stigma.
Exactly. So it was a pretty cool article. If you want to, really read into it, it's a little bit longer, but I kind of just picked out, the key points, the summary highlights.
Yeah.
And this was Sunday Baines from LinkedIn.
Great job.
The second one I want to talk about is from Brown Girl Magazine.
Oh, I feel like we've definitely extracted some articles from that website.
Yeah, they have good stuff.
They do.
So this particular article, How Model Minority Myths Fail Neurodivergent South Asians, was written by Mrinal Gokale. I hope I said that last name right. And she basically starts off by saying that neurodivergent people may struggle with tasks like time management, organization, reading, writing, concentration, and multitasking. But the lack of educational support, therapy, medication, or other necessary support can lead to low self-esteem, poor grades, depression, anxiety, social and emotional difficulties, and more that can lead and carry into adulthood if they're not properly addressed.
Right. That makes sense. If you are constantly been put to shame for your learning needs, for being different than the neurotypical person next to you, and you're not doing as well in school, right? You're being punished. All of that can really affect your self-esteem and how you view yourself.
It's not a far jump from there to nothing I do is ever good enough. I'm not good.
For sure.
And that's just not fair. This is why we need to have very inclusive educational systems and support systems in place. Mrinal goes on to say that, the model minority myth, basically it refers to the false notion that certain groups of people are seemingly effortlessly successful, right? So often in our media now, South Asians are often portrayed as nerdy class valedictorians. looking at you, never have I ever, or IT and healthcare professionals as adults. If that view is constantly perpetuated with no diversity, it's possible that school staff and clinicians even can really internalize these stereotypes
Right.
and unconsciously overlook South Asian students that are suffering internally that might not
Right.
necessarily fit the more like white centric symptoms.
Right.
They might get missed. And obviously, that continues to perpetuate their suffering that'll lead on into adulthood and continue to, harm their mental health around that too, their self-belief around it too.
Yeah.
It'll create even more challenges without helping them really access the necessary resources and tools to recognize their strengths and learn how to play to those strengths.
Exactly. That makes sense.
Yeah. So the model minority myth just needs to
go away.
It needs to change. Yeah, it needs to go away. Just go away.
Yeah.
We don't need to.
And I feel like that model minority myth I've heard not just exclusive to South Asians, but like Asians in general, just that those high expectations, those high standards, that stereotype, this population, and it can really lead to lots of internalization, lots of self-doubt, self-esteem issues if you don't meet those standards, which is not a bad thing, right? Like everybody's different.
I mean, obviously, yes, some of the stereotypes that we have are sometimes rooted in some belief, in some truth, but it's overgeneralizing to say oh, this entire population of people are like that. What? No. There's always going to be certain people that stand out for various reasons, and you might see patterns. But that doesn't mean you can apply that to every single person in a group.
Yeah.
You cannot. So Mrinal goes on to give 2 examples of professionals who have dealt with neurodiversity in South Asian populations.
Yeah.
And I want to highlight those 2 professionals. So one of them is Dr. Pratika Gonsalves. She's a child psychologist in Mumbai, in India. And she feels that neurodivergent children are very bright, they're very creative, they're out-of-box thinkers with untapped talents. For example, having extensive vocabulary, photographic memory, and visual learning abilities. And in her experience, she knows that learning disabilities can sometimes even coexist with high IQs. And so
I've definitely heard of that.
Parents, yeah, exactly. But she notes that educating parents has been kind of an uphill battle because of that very reason. Because they see it as, okay, well, they have really high IQ, they're so smart, their grades are fine. I don't think they have any issues. They can't.
There's lots of misconceptions.
Yeah, exactly. So one time, Dr. Gonzalez talks about how she met the parents of a 5-year-old who was recently diagnosed with autism. Now, these parents believed that the test was inaccurate because the child was not intellectually delayed. And so the doctor explained that not every autistic person has intellectual impairments, but the parents insisted that their child just has to be like other kids and must be, and if they'll be okay. And that really showcases how there's just so many misconceptions of what it looks like and what it means to have any of these labels.
And how much the society has instilled fear in parents.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of my child's going to be different. What's going to happen? They just spiral, right?
Absolutely. Fear of the unknown is really strong. Yeah. And it is scary. I mean, that's the truth. It is scary.
It is.
But operating from that fear alone can prevent your kid from really thriving.
Exactly.
When it's definitely possible with the right resources.
Right. And the right tools.
Yeah. So exactly that, the doctor was trying to show them that the child has very unique strengths and how, therapy and specific programs will allow them to maintain their strengths and give them even relief for the parts that they struggle with. But this was specifically a male patient. He was a boy. And she goes on to say that she's had experiences with other parents, parents of girls who having this conversation is even harder. And this is a quote. She says, if parents are told that their daughters show sign of autism, they'll deny it or even stop talking to those people. Oh, wow. I've seen parents that will spend money to treat their son's mental health, but with daughters, they get scared and hide it because she won't get marriage proposals and will be seen as a liability.
Oh, wow. That's deep.
It's not just fear of what this label means. It's also fear of
low-cagging, right?
Exactly.
All of that.
Exactly. And I mean, it sounds almost like that can be real, can it? But yeah, this happens. I've heard I have a client who talks about how her parents ask her to not share some of the medical things that she's going through because they have that fear of they'll see you as having, these flaws, these things that aren't desirable. Don't share that with them. And she's like, I'm not going to not share that with them. I have to be honest in these relationships.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's awesome that she can see that she wants to be authentic in that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a big burden to have your parents say, don't do that, and put that fear in you that you wouldn't be desirable. That still happens. It's scary.
That is scary.
I'll talk about a different professional now. So this professional is actually in California. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Her name is Marissa Patel. Marissa Patel, basically, her experience was with ADHD, and she talks about how ADHD is often diagnosed beyond childhood or not at all among females. Meanwhile, she recognizes that a lot of boys have been misdiagnosed without proper assessment based on things like acting out. Girls with ADHD are likely to be seen as quiet, well-behaved, and non-confrontational, when in reality, they could be crying for help internally.
Right.
Yeah. Additionally, she goes on to say that many people don't know that multiple ADHD types exist and take on their own form when someone's cultural, familial, and societal dynamics and expectations are added, which is why there's just such a need for like nuance and like cultural competence when it comes to treating these things, because it doesn't look one way. It's a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And moreover, current research is really centered around, the white population, and that's not
representative.
inclusive.
It's not representative.
Exactly. Later in the article, it also says that Patel has seen elders praise brown children for studying until they burn out for higher grades, which furthers the myth that low grades are required for diagnosis. She believes that the model minority myth can discourage one from expressing vulnerability and impedes on the emotional intelligence development.
Yeah.
Because they're seen as, okay, you have to be like this. You can't step out of line.
Yeah.
Or what will people think? Again. And the last thing I'll quote is a specific quote that she says. Marissa Patel says that I've seen several adult clients in the past year seek support in processing their ADHD diagnosis. Most had conflicting feelings of shame and relief. The shame from the feeling that they've let their families down, and the relief from getting an explanation for their struggles that was previously described as lazy, misbehaved, or unintelligent.
That's so important to clear that up, because being labeled as lazy or misbehaved when you're not trying to be, I can't imagine. Right? Like,
frustrating.
Yeah.
To feel like there's something wrong with you when you're just like, I'm just existing over here, living my life. Yeah, this is why labels can sometimes be like such a good thing, because it can really help people finally feel that relief of, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. There is a label for people like me, which means there are other people like that.
Right.
Sometimes these labels
really isolating.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it can be something that we really feel empowered by.
Exactly.
On the flip side, though, sometimes it can also sometimes be a crutch that we lean on to not change and grow. That always just depends.
Right. Just depends.
But yeah, that was the stuff that I found for how neurodiversity shows up and how it affects South Asians.
I love it. I think all that you mentioned about the misconceptions of thinking that neurodiversity is equal to misbehaving, acting out, being lazy, not normal, right? All of that language, I think exists. And unfortunately, I think it still exists till this day. And like you mentioned, the author in the LinkedIn article mentioned all the things that needs to take place to kind of help move us forward is that research. I think you're right. That will build a lot of credibility to dismantle these stereotypes in our culture. Is that, hey, like this is real, it exists in our culture, this is what it can look like. These are the things that as parents you can do, as teachers you can do, right? Like giving guidance to the people that interact with these kids that can be diagnosed.
Just another thing to add to our need for normalization.
Right.
Research. Well, shall we get into our story?
Yes. I'm ready for your story.
Let's do it. So, like I said earlier today, I actually didn't even realize that I was neurodivergent until I really looked into the research on this. And I was like, I guess that also applies to me.
Wow, what a revelation.
I know. What a revelation to have through our podcast. I love that.
Yes. Learning more about ourselves through this.
This is great. Good part of
Mhm.
self-reflection journey,
I love it.
self-healing journey.
Yeah, literally, I feel like I've said this to you so many times. It's my journal.
Yeah, it kind
My
of is.
public journal.
Yeah, a public journal just gets publicized to worldwide.
Yes,
Nobody has to
yes.
listen.
Open book here, world.
That's not scary at all. So as I was reflecting on this, and as maybe you recall, the part that makes me neurodivergent is because I'm a highly sensitive person. That's an official term. And as I was reflecting on that, I realized, growing up, like I was always told I was too emotional by like
Mm,
literally everybody. I'm talking friends, teachers, even parents, like
wow.
just everybody. Everybody saw me as too emotional. And obviously, when everybody tells you that in kind of a tone, you're going to start to
Mhm,
feel like maybe that's a bad thing. Is there something wrong with me that I'm too emotional? Why am I too emotional?
mhm.
Right. So I had a lot of like, I don't know, like kind of mixed feelings. Part of me was
Yeah,
like, this is just who I am. Like, damn, why are people on
yeah,
me all the time?
yeah.
And the other part of me was like, yeah, maybe there's something wrong with me.
Mm,
Why is it like this? But I mean, now I can recognize what my too emotional nature has really given me. And I see it as a strength now because me being seen as too emotional and being too
yeah,
emotional means that I'm a really good listener.
yeah, you are.
I am a good listener and I love being a cheerleader for my friends and family, and I'm good at it
You are.
because I'm too emotional. I can connect with their emotions, I can cheer them on,
Yeah.
whether they're things they're celebrating or when they're down, and I think that the same people who would call me too emotional would also agree that they see me as someone who is a very like warm, loving kind of presence, and they admire that. But on the flip side, they call me too emotional, right? But
Mhm,
it's the same coin, just a different side of it. And, I think that it also allows me to love deeply and freely without that restriction of, oh, this is too emotional. This is enough. This is the right
mm.
amount. Honestly, it makes me a kick ass therapist because
It
I'm a
does.
warm, safe space for my clients.
Yes, very
I get,
approachable.
yeah, exactly. So
Lots of
even though
strengths.
growing up, what's that?
Lots of strengths.
Lots of strengths. That's what I'm saying. It's a
Mhm.
superpower. It is a
It
strength.
is.
But growing up, it didn't feel like that. It felt like there was something wrong with me, that I shouldn't be this way because everybody would point it out. Now I can see, being on the other end of it all, that, yeah, maybe that meant I cried more. Maybe that it meant I felt more and I hurt more. But that's a part of life. Crying, hurting, feeling all the emotions is a part of
Mhm.
life. Just because I felt it more doesn't mean that that was wrong. It
Right.
just is what it was. That's how I felt. And now I realize that the other side of that coin of, okay, I feel deeply, I hurt deeply, is I also love deeply.
Yeah.
I can be happy deeply.
I love the positive side of my coin to focus on the strengths. I mean, it literally helps you do your job well, right, in your career.
Exactly. I really do think that that's the exact reason that makes me a fantastic therapist,
Exactly.
among other things. So as I was reflecting on this, like I said, I really just never connected the dots before that I would be considered neurodivergent. But as I was reading over it, and I was like, I think I might be. So I Googled it up. I was like, are highly sensitive people neurodivergent? And the answer was a resounding yes, yes, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So to kind of talk about it though, what it means to be a highly sensitive person, like I said earlier, is like we're very sensitive to stimuli, like senses, our
Right.
five senses, right? So sometimes, like how it affects me personally is that sometimes when I have a busy day or
Mhm.
I talk to too many people or I socialize too much, I need lots of time to just recharge. I need a
Yeah.
lot more alone time than most people to fill my cup, to recharge, to
Mm.
feel like myself again.
Yeah.
I'm also really, really, really sensitive to light. Like I literally cannot go out in the summers without sunglasses. I will not be able to see.
Wow.
There are times when I will literally, like short distance, if we're going to the supermarket and I forget my sunglasses, I will literally close my eyes, give my
No.
hand to my husband, and be like, pull me to the car.
Yeah, but look at
It's
your
like a
tools,
physical
like,
thing.
you know that you need your sunglasses.
Yeah.
That's your tool
Yeah,
right there, your resource.
exactly. I have a new tool recently. I don't think you know this actually,
Okay.
but recently I've discovered that I'm very sensitive to like noises. So
Mm.
when I'm in the car and Ali plays like some nice guzzles and like he's just playing and
Mhm.
he's trying to vibe out, and then he tries to talk to me and there's a road noise, that is too much
That
noise
is
for
a lot
me.
of stimuli.
It
Mhm.
is. There's just way too much happening. And
Yeah.
I was always getting frustrated. He would be like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
But eventually, actually, another HSP client, actually, she put me onto this. They're these little buds. They look like AirPods. They're not connectivity. They're just buds. And they're called the Loop. Super helpful. I took them one day to a comedy show that one of my friends was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I had them on the whole time. And I was like, okay, this is good. This is good. And he was like, can you hear okay? So I took one out briefly. Oh my God. I was blown away by how loud it was without those buds. I was like, I could not survive 30 seconds with that bud out. I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad I brought this along.
So what does it do? Like, does it filter the noise and only the loudest noise you hear, like in a show?
It just kind of like muffles all the noises. So it makes it a little bit more bearable. But the weird side effect I'm noticing is if I'm eating or swallowing or even breathing, I'll hear that really loudly in my ears. So it was really funny because I was trying to communicate to Avi. It was the first time we were trying it out. And I kept talking like this because obviously we're outside. I don't want to yell. And he's like, what? I'm screaming, aren't I? He's like, no, I can't hear you.
It's so funny.
And I couldn't
imagine this interaction. Like, what?
I know. I was like, are you messing with me or is it serious? But that's a new discovery that I had made. Another cool one, as I was thinking about this, another really cool one is when I listen to music that I think is really moving or like, I don't know, just like touches me or like art or even movies sometimes that really just feel, I don't even know how to express this, but that just feel very profound, I guess. I get goosebumps and I start crying.
When what touches you?
Music or like something like a play or like a scene that I'm reading. If something feels really profound, it's a weird phenomenon that triggers, but there's actually a term for it. I forgot what it's called now, but there's a term for it.
I think, is it synesthesia? I've heard of that.
I think so, actually.
Wait, well, I was looking into that too, and it's more like when you close your eyes and listen to music, you see colors.
Okay, that's not it then. That's not it.
I think it might be that, or like that's synesthesia. I could be wrong. I might not be saying the right term, but there is a term for that, like where you can see colors when you listen to music.
That is fascinating.
Right?
I've never heard of that before.
Right? I'm so interested.
I never heard of that, but this one is frisson. Apparently it's a thing though, okay? Because there are several articles about this.
Okay.
It says chills happen when we listen to great music thanks to our ancient brain responses to stunning and enveloping sensory experiences.
Wow.
The music speaks to us on a visceral level, moving us deeply. And apparently that intense emotion from musical pleasure in particular is called frisson or frisson. It's a French term, apparently.
I've never heard of that.
It means shiver, goosebumps.
That's interesting.
Fascinating.
Very fascinating.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've noticed is, this is kind of a recent thing that I keep telling everybody about, and they're so done with me. I've been noticing that I really cannot handle anything remotely suspenseful or violent or heavy in anything that I read and anything I watch and anything I listen to. I will avoid it like the plague. You watch, like I couldn't even watch the presidential debate the other day. I was like, no, that's too much, too real, bye-bye. But it's gone to the point recently where I can only surround myself with really, really light, feel-good, happy things like comedy or romance genre are currently the only two things that I indulge in. So that means a lot of K-dramas and a lot of romance books. And I'm okay with that. Yeah. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But
it's good that you're aware.
To watch any movies, though.
Yeah, and it's good that you're aware though. Like instead of you not knowing, what will support you and what will not, right? So now you can make those choices consciously.
I do. And I do make those choices, but it drives everybody around me crazy, especially Adi. He's like, can you just watch this with me? I'm like, no, I don't know how it's going to end.
That's fair.
It's okay. It is what it is. There are pros and there are cons to this.
Right.
And that's very, that's very similar to everybody else who experiences neurodivergence. There are pros and there are cons to it, just like with neurotypical people.
And a big con, I would say, is like acceptance, right? Which is something that a lot of people can still struggle with, right? Like even the fact that you are making the conscious choice of not wanting to engage in that, but other people around you not liking that, right? That's another way of I'm not being accepted, which again goes back to our society's misconceptions and fear of the differences, of the unknown, of uncertainty. right? Not having this being normalized. Yeah, not letting this be normalized.
So that's my story. That's my reflection.
Well, thank you. I do remember you mentioning in another podcast episode about sunlight, but I didn't know about the other sensitivities. So I'm glad you kind of educated me so then I know about these little new things about you. Learn some new things.
I'm also sensitive to smell, but that's a grosser one I didn't want to talk about.
That's fair. That's why you have your poopery, probably. I mean, I think you and Adi were the ones that introduced us to poopery. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. And I'm sure that helps you. The poopery.
No, it's weirdly, it makes it worse.
Really?
Yeah, it makes it worse. Because it's like, this is so TMI for everybody listening, but it's like there's a good smell and there's a bad smell that mingles, and I'm like, nope.
That's fair. I guess if you're really highly sensitive, instead of one smell masking the other, like you smell both of them at the same time. Ooh, interesting.
Well, it's interesting that your thought went there. I meant specifically when I'm the one who has to throw out old food in the fridge. Oh my gosh. It's a nightmare.
What about cooking?
Reflex. No, I don't mind like
cooking
yummy
smells, like onion frying. Or...
No, I love that. I'm just like, give me more. I'm hungry. As of now, at least, it's exclusively showing up when I am trying to throw out things that Adi puts in a Tupperware in the fridge and just leaves it there, and I have to throw it out.
Gotcha.
That's
like rotten food or like spoiled food, spoiled milk.
Yeah, that's when it's not hypersensitive.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. So far, nothing else, thankfully.
Okay, good.
I'll keep you updated.
Well, thank you for enlightening me and us and helping normalize neurodivergence by sharing your own experience with it and, you know, putting it out there and being vulnerable. I think it's very admirable. Thank you for sharing. And breaking barriers and normalizing one step at a time.
One step at a time.
Exactly. I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you for learning about this, researching about this, educating yourself, figuring out what works for you, what doesn't, and then advocating for yourself and setting boundaries.
You're my cheerleader.
Heart. Ooh, look at the heart. I love it. Okay, so mine is also a little bit story, background, reflection. So I'm going to get into it. So I wanted to first talk about that the concept of neurodiversity, let alone the word neurodiversity, was not discussed much in my household. And I can say even in the society we grew up in, like you mentioned, the neurodiversity movement was not even until the 90s. And so even a new concept that recent, I'm sure can take a long time to kind of come into fruition in society as a whole. So in my South Asian household, that word, that concept wasn't really discussed. My only exposure to like neurodivergent individuals was like interacting with them in school when they would have different support needs or learning needs. In my household, I heard the words not normal, born different, you know, and my parents did teach me to be respectful to everyone no matter what. But I would say I learned more about this after I was older and educated myself through reading. So I noticed that I was not taught officially about neurodivergence at a young age, even in school, officially, right? Which I think is very important. And we talked about that earlier, is it's not even normalized in the education system. And that's really surprising to me when, you know, when we're learning about these historical facts, the civil rights movement, the different movements, like this should also be part of history and should be given importance in teaching young kids about this, again, which will help, you know, destigmatize people with neurodiversity. I noticed that in the society culture I grew up in, neurodivergent individuals' needs weren't addressed. They were often ignored. If people had different neurodivergent needs, they were labeled as being sensitive, too emotional, lazy, like they're misbehaving, they're incompetent. Those are the kind of the words that would come up when people's neurodivergent symptoms would show. But, you know, thinking about all this, I say to myself that a person's diagnosis, their neurological diagnosis, is not their fault. It's not their character. It doesn't define their character, which is really important to remember. And I feel that so much, and this is in general too, in the South Asian culture, so much of a person's accomplishments, grades, are related to their character or their identity when they're two separate things. Yeah. So if a neurological, like, difference is making them not do as well in school, like you mentioned, right? Like not then it's kind of mixed into their character, like, oh, you're not working hard enough, you don't care about school, when that's maybe not the case. Isolating and labeling them is not the solution. Addressing equity, building awareness, and having conversations to normalize are the steps forward, right? So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of my experience with neurodivergence just in my work, especially working with children. So right out of college, while I was a teacher, I worked with neurodivergent students who had different learning needs and accommodations. And often, like in the education system, these learning needs are communicated through the administration, the counselor, or like assistant principal or principal. We're given these official paperwork that kind of talks about what are the different learning needs that this student might need. So some examples are that some of my students, they had trouble concentrating. And so some of the accommodations would be like sitting in the front of the class. They're allowed to use fidget toys, flexible seating like a bean bag, or they're able to stand or walk around in the back of the class. So there, again, those are different examples of accommodations that I was able to provide for those neurodivergent students.
That's awesome.
Thinking back to my education to become a teacher, I'm sure there was a class that we probably talked about this, but I don't think it was pretty like efficient training for learning about this, especially like what you mentioned. Teachers, counselors, parents are the first line people to look for symptoms and signs. And that's not something that I was educated on. At least I didn't feel competent in my education to be a teacher where I could look for signs and kind of refer to the parent, refer to the counselor, like, hey, I'm seeing these signs. Maybe they should be assessed. Right. I think teachers and parents, they spend a lot of time with young kids and students, and they might be the best people to look for these signs. But it all starts with educating these educators about this. And that I think is missing.
Yeah. And I mean, even as a therapist, I do not recall ever learning about neurodivergence. This is a more, at least in my experience and my memory, what I'm realizing is it's a very recent term that I'm hearing over the last maybe 2 years, possibly 3 years.
Very recent.
It's a very recent that we're actually making it more known and talking about it. And so obviously I had graduated much before then, right? So I didn't learn about it. I do not recall any of that. Maybe like a sentence, perhaps, possibly, but I doubt it. And that's harmful too. I mean, I'm a therapist. If people are coming to me, I have to be aware of these things or I will continue to perpetuate the neurotypical agenda. Right?
Exactly.
That's just so harmful.
I think that every career that works with people, adult, children, neurodiversity doesn't discriminate. If you're working with people, you need to have education, extensive education.
Continuing education.
Yeah, continuing education and educate, like not a chapter in a course, right? It needs to be a course by itself, training modules on like hands-on training on it. People need to be equipped and prepared, have the tools to be able to support people with that neurodiversity. And if you don't have that, like you said, you're perpetuating the neurotypical agenda, the neurotypical expectations, when that's not the case.
Exactly.
So, you know this about me, right? I also worked as a registered behavior technician in an applied behavioral analysis clinic to support children, or to support, children with autism. And like you mentioned earlier, like having them adapt and learn to be and live and work in a neurotypical world, right? And we were able to see like the effects of this, which was so positive. And it was an early intervention clinic. So I worked with children as young as 2 and 3 who I think the research says that autism can be diagnosed as young as 2 years old. And so while working there, I learned that the stereotypes and biases that society has labeled people with autism, they're wrong. These individuals may communicate differently. They might have different likes, dislikes, hobbies, but with the right tools and support, they are very capable of being successful human beings. Like you mentioned, they can, once they're assessed for how they learn the best, they can learn new things. All kids are malleable. All kids can learn, no matter whether there's neurodiversity or not. But however, society tends to dismiss people with neurodiversity, their voice. and their ability just because they sound and look different than what is considered neurotypical or normal. So part of my current work as a child life specialist is to advocate for neurodivergent pediatric patients. I assess and learn about I work with the caregivers and assess and learn more about past medical experience that patient might have, sensitivities, triggers, how the patient learns the best, what brings comfort to the patient, trying to kind of get a comprehensive assessment of just what triggers this patient, what regulates their emotions, what dysregulates their emotions, but what also provides them comfort and support. What are the triggers? And then I use all that information to create a coping plan for the hospital visit or clinic visit or a procedure if it's like a blood draw or IV placement. And once I, gather this information, I communicate the most important information through a plan to the medical team who will be working with this patient. So I include information that will minimize stress and triggers for the patient. So like, for example, a lot of patients that I work with that are neurodivergent, they might have different sensitivities or stressors or triggers. And so one patient that I work with had a stressor for touch. Touch is like the caregiver shared that the touch is stressful for them. And so I was able to communicate to the medical team that it's important to minimize touch time on the patients. If it's not medically required to touch the patient or their arm for the procedure, like to not touch them. Like, sometimes staff will like do the friendly touch on the shoulder, friendly touch on the back, right? We can minimize all of that. Another example is stranger anxiety. A lot of, pediatric patients that I work with different neurodivergent diagnoses, they might have stranger anxiety. And so I'll ask the medical team to minimize the number of medical staff in the room, minimize the number of strangers in the room, or advocating for the caregiver to be really close to the patient during the procedure so they can see, hear the caregiver who's familiar to that patient.
No idea. Wow. I love hearing about this side of your work. It's so fascinating.
Yeah. And this is something I do on a day-to-day basis, neurodivergent patient or not, right? I like assess the patient, come up with a coping plan, figure out what stresses them, what triggers them. But I wanted to point out that there is so much stigma still, even in the healthcare system, of these patients, of these people, right? It's not just exclusive to the education system, like I mentioned. It exists everywhere. And so I will find that sometimes when I'm advocating for these patients, I have to sometimes double advocate or like be in the room myself if I can to make sure please don't touch their back if you don't need to, or, just very politely gentle reminders, just because these things are overlooked, right? These behaviors aren't considered neurotypical. And so they aren't as accepted as they should be. But I think acknowledging and addressing and learn. It's all about curiosity, right? Like learning about people that are neurodivergent, like what helps you, what supports you, what stresses you, what are your triggers. Once you learn about that person and you know what tools they need, that's it. That's all you need, right? To have a positive interaction. Curiosity over assumptions, always.
Yes. Always a good rule of thumb.
Yes.
In any interaction.
Exactly. So kind of that was like a little bit of my like career background experience with neurodivergent individuals. But, looking within the South Asian community, I think in the South Asian community, I would say this topic is one that still needs a lot of progress. And I think we learned that through your research as well. There are biases and stereotypes that still surround neurodivergent people today, which is not okay. I see it all the time. And I think the first few steps is to educate ourselves, in addition to what you mentioned, right? The research and everything. But I think even as individuals, as part of the community, we can start educating ourselves, reframing our mindsets, right? Looking up the different neurodivergent diagnoses and see how we can support if someone around you has the symptoms, how we can support them. And then normalizing in conversation, like you said. I actually saw this video and I can share the link to this video that I would love to share about how assumptions can become reality for people. I don't know if you've seen this video. It's really short. It's called Assume I Can. The main character is this girl with Down syndrome. And she kind of sends this message in this video that if you assume that I cannot write, then you're not going to create opportunities for me to learn to write. So then I don't write. That becomes my reality. So assumptions can become a person's reality. And that's so important to think about, right? If we assume a person can't do something, then we're not going to give them the opportunity to learn to do that. So I'll definitely share the link and I'll send it to you too as well. It was very moving. But yeah, that was my reflection, my story.
That was awesome. You know, I can't ever think of the word assume without thinking of this little phrase. I don't know if you've ever heard this. It's a pretty common saying, but Ivy first introduced it to me because I used to apparently make a lot of assumptions. It'd be like, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Because us who
Oh, I love it.
you and me, ass you me.
I have heard of this, but I forgot about it. So now you reminded me of it. It's so important. It's true.
I cannot think of that word without that phrase. So
Yeah.
that helps me not assume. So hey, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. Don't assume, people.
Curiosity over assumption. There you go.
Thank you for sharing, your insights in this. I mean, I hadn't really stopped to think about it, but it's so true. We really are very behind in lots of ways in our educational system, particularly around inclusivity and how people learn. I mean, I know it was like almost like an inkling of a thought when I was still in school. I remember, well, more like when I was in college, I started hearing more people talk about, oh, I'm a visual learner. I'm a tactile learner.
Yeah.
That was just starting to be a part of the conversation. So hopefully now, they start them young with not just being like, this is the way we teach, but allowing space for diversity, inclusivity.
Right. And I'll say, I remember pre-K, kindergarten, you learn to love each other. It's okay to be different. There's books about that you read in kindergarten.
We lose that though.
But let's take that to the next step, right? When you go into upper elementary school, middle school, high school, let's continue the conversation in developmentally appropriate ways.
Middle school was a nightmare, especially middle school. Yeah. Let's remember that lesson.
Yeah. And I just keep thinking, right? A lot of these, I'm sure there's statistics on this too, a lot of students that are neurodivergent, what are their bullying statistics, right? What are the statistics of them, their social circle, their friends, right? All of that. And how is that being addressed in the education system?
More likely not.
Yeah.
One thing's for sure, it's like we've been saying, right? Research just needs to be done. That's more culturally competent and inclusive.
Exactly. So if you're a listener and you're looking for a research topic, here is one. If you're passionate about this,
students, here you go.
We need you.
This is a wonderful topic.
Yes.
Untapped market.
Yes, exactly.
Alrighty. Ready to wrap this up?
Yes. All right. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We're really appreciative that you're here with us. If anything resonated with you, or you would like to send any comments or feedback, you can reach us to our email, which is talksouthasiantome@gmail.com, or our socials, which is the handle @talksouthasiantome. And be sure to go to our YouTube channel, subscribe, give us 5-star reviews, Spotify. We would love to see your feedback. Thank you. Bye.